Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Something interesting is happening in Canada. The mood of the public is changing. People's opinions are shifting. In the face of Donald Trump's threats to our economy and our security and our sovereignty, Canadians are showing resolve. And with that resolve has come an appetite to change things. To change how we do things in Canada so that we don't have to rely on America quite so much. In the past week, this sentiment has really crystallized on one issue, a microcosm of the economic mood of the nation. And that is the energy industry, specifically oil and gas production. And even more specifically, pipelines. I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, trade wars, climate action, and revisiting the politics of oil and gas pipelines. New national polling from the Angus Reid Institute has found that Canadians want to see pipelines built. They want to see infrastructure projects that will help reduce Canada's reliance on the United States as a trading partner. And that includes finding new markets for our oil and gas. A shift in public opinion with the backdrop of Trump's trade war. I'm joined today by Jon Roe, Research Associate at the Angus Reid Institute. Hi, Jon.
Hi, David.
So, based on your latest research, does it look like Canadians are warming to the idea of building new oil and gas pipelines in this country?
I would say yes. So we asked about a couple of different pipeline projects that were canceled years ago and tried to engage how opinion had changed on them in the wake of these Trump tariff threats. And for one, so the Energy East pipeline, which would have taken oil from Alberta all the way to New Brunswick, in 2019, support for that project was about 58%. Now it's 65%. So we've seen a 7-point jump in support for that project. We've also seen an increase in support for the Northern Gateway pipeline, which was another project that would have taken oil from Alberta to the north coast of BC. And support for that has increased as well. So we are seeing people kind of become more engaged and more interested in this pipeline project. And I think because of the threat that Trump's tariffs have posed to Canada so far.
Yeah, why do you think people are connecting the idea of building pipelines with the threat of the U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods? Do you think that that's what people are doing? They're drawing a line between the economic uncertainty encapsulated in that threat and the idea of going back to a real robust national development of oil and gas resources in this country? Are people connecting those two things?
I think they are. So we asked another question just to try to gauge, I guess, how people feel about pipelines in general. And it was an agree or disagree statement. So people could say they agree or disagree with the statement. And the statement was the Canadian economy will be greatly strengthened if more oil and gas pipeline capacity is built. And more than close to 2/3 of Canadians say, yeah, I agree. That's what's going to be the case. So I think what we've seen is kind of this great economic threat from Donald Trump and these tariffs that he's threatened to put in, whether or not they end up happening after the 30-day reprieve, it's still up in the air. There's a lot of uncertainty involved. And I think Canadians are looking at that and they're understanding and just how damaging those tariffs could be. And they're looking for ways to kind of strengthen our own economy. So they're looking at things like pipelines, and then they're also looking at things like interprovincial trade barriers. So all those things are these kind of like, okay, well, what should the Canadian government do in response? And here are some things that Canadians believe should be happening to kind of in response to Donald Trump's tariffs.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You know, it's not just the buy Canadian produce and cancel your vacation to America this spring and summer. People are definitely taking a longer term view of the whole thing and really thinking big picture about the nature of Canada's economy. It's fascinating. So I want to kind of break this down piece by piece. And some background for the listeners here. When Justin Trudeau first took office, there were three main pipeline projects up for approval in Canada. There was the one that did end up getting built, that's Trans Mountain. Kinder Morgan was the owner of that pipeline. The federal government actually bought it from them and used public money to finish building it because Kinder Morgan abandoned it after too many delays and too much opposition. That was the one that did end up getting built. It's operating today. But then there was Northern Gateway and Energy East, two other plans. Energy East was a plan to run a pipeline from Hardisty, Alberta, to the Irving Oil Refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. A direct line from the oil sands to the East Coast refinery that did not leave Canada. That was the vision. TransCanada, filed their application for that in 2013. After 4 years of regulatory hurdles, public opposition, and falling oil prices as well, TransCanada abandoned that project, and it has never been revived. But people still remember the name, Energy East. It was in the news so much back then over those 4 years. And John, according to your research, there's more support now for Energy East than there was before. Is that right?
Yeah, so we last asked about Energy East in 2019, and this was after the project had been canceled. And then it was about 58% of Canadians that said that they supported the project, and that's risen now to 65%. And of course, one of the key linchpins in getting Energy East completed was in Quebec. So the pipeline was converting an old natural gas pipeline up until Quebec, where they needed to build a new pipeline to get all the way to New Brunswick. And that part was always very controversial because the politicians there in Quebec were against it. Kind of famously, the mayor of Montreal at the time was very much kind of on the helping kind of lead the charge against it. And at the time in 2019, only 33% of people in Quebec supported that pipeline, Energy East. Now that's gone up to 47%. So it is still the lowest in the country, but even there where there was a lot of opposition, I think people are looking at it now with this different lens. And there is more support there, though. Again, it's not up quite to a majority level, but there is increasing support in Quebec, which had kind of been the problem with the pipeline initially that got it canceled in the first place.
Yeah, maybe not a majority level, but 47% is pretty close, especially when compared with 33. And it's so fascinating that the public support for Energy East is growing so much more in Quebec than in the rest of the country, because it was a real sovereigntist issue back then. Quebec provincial politics and Quebec nationalism is an incredibly complex situation, and obviously has deep history and deep cultural roots in that province. And the stumbling block back then was essentially an argument of, well, this is Western Canadian interests and Eastern Canadian interests trampling on our sovereignty, running a pipeline through our territory that we're not going to really benefit from. Fast forward, with the specter of a trade war, with possibility of tariffs, aluminum tariffs already now announced by Mr. Trump, will significantly impact the Quebec economy. The public is taking a more holistic view of this pipeline issue. It's just fascinating. And then if we take a look in the other direction, John, from east to west, Northern Gateway was a plan from Enbridge to build a twin pipeline from Bruderheim, Alberta to Kitimat, BC. It would have moved imported natural gas from Kitimat east into Alberta and then moved oil from Alberta west to the BC coast for export. Enbridge abandoned that project in 2016, just after Justin Trudeau was elected. If that project, Northern Gateway, was to be resurrected, would people be open to seeing it built now?
Yeah, the support for Northern Gateway is above the majority level as well. It's 54% of Canadians say they support it. And that is twice the number that say they oppose it. So there's 26% of Canadians are opposed, which is a very kind of ringing endorsement. It's not nearly as big support as there is out there for Energy East. And notably, too, because Northern Gateway ran into issues going through BC, and there was a lot of opposition in BC at the time. People in BC are supportive of this pipeline now. It's 55% say they support that pipeline. At the time, prior polling, there was a lot less support for that one, but it does appear that all these kind of alternative pipelines to mostly it's to diversify the market for Canadian oil. Northern Gateway doesn't really help people, I guess, get more gas in their cars or move uh, oil to refineries in that way. But it does broaden the market, which is what kind of Trans Mountain has done since its completion. So there is support for Northern Gateway as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? It's not necessarily about having the gasoline in your car be refined in Canada. People are based on these numbers, it seems like people are really thinking big picture about Canada's reliance on the US as a trading partner. It's about finding new export opportunities for this product should that trading relationship with the US go sour. Um, so when you look, John, as a pollster, when you look at some of these differentials, how the support has grown over time since 2019, um, are those integers big enough? Are those differentials big enough that these are public opinion numbers politicians and policymakers will look at and respond to? What do you think?
I think so. 7 points when we're talking about the change in difference in support for Energy East doesn't seem like a lot, but that does indicate that there has been a shift. Like it's statistically significant, so it's like big enough that it matters. And I think that does at least send a message saying that there is more openness to these projects than there were at the time. And of course, I mean, one of the big issues with these pipeline projects is that they have such long timelines that what if it had even been approved in 2017? Who knows if it would have been completed by now? So we're looking at these projects. We're trying to plan for the future, and there's a lot of support for it right now. But I think the issue for a lot of politicians too is like, okay, well, how durable is that support? Is that support going to be there in the future, or is that support going to change depending on what the circumstances are? But for now, we are seeing very strong support for these projects, and I think within the context of these Trump tariffs.
Okay. So if we take a look back at how Canadians have polled on climate change and climate change issues over the past number of years, there's a theme. Just looking at some old news headlines here, I'll just throw a few out. June of 2019, Canadians are worried about climate change, but many don't want to pay taxes to fight it. November 2022, 6 in 10 Canadians can't or don't want to pay more taxes to fight climate change. October 2023, Canadians want urgent climate action, but most not willing to pay more tax. October 2024, public concern about climate change drops 14 points since last year. So those are various polls by various pollsters over the past 5 years. Angus Reid as well has published results in line with those headlines over the years. I spent a lot of time reading polls before this interview. Do you think, John, is it fair to say that when times are good, Canadians feel strongly about taking action on climate change? But when things are bad, when the economy is stagnant, when people feel insecure like they do right now, climate change quickly drops down the list of public priorities. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think it is fair to say it is something that we've seen in our own polling, just looking at top issues in the post-pandemic era. So prior to 2020, well, obviously when the COVID-19 pandemic first emerged, climate change, environmental issues, it was a top 3, top 4 concern with Canadians. If you fast forward a little bit further down, we have issues with cost of living and housing affordability, which has become more of a countrywide problem when initially it was mostly concentrated in Vancouver, Toronto, Ontario. Now that those are kind of wider country problems, people are a lot less concerned about climate change. That's fallen down the list to still a top 5 issue, but a significant drop. And it hasn't really, though that is the case, it hasn't really changed people's perspectives on the issue itself, in the sense that when we ask Canadians specifically about climate change, whether or not they believe it's real and a fact, and or also asking whether it's a threat to Canadians, those assessments have remained the same. I was just looking at some of those numbers today. We haven't released our most recent take of those numbers, but we're doing that soon. And those numbers are very similar to what they were a few years ago. So it is definitely, I think it's a priority thing, where if you're dealing with high cost of living, You can't afford to buy groceries. Groceries are more expensive than they used to be. All these factors, your rent, your mortgage, all these things are very expensive. That becomes less of a concern. So that is something we're seeing in our polling, that climate change has become less pressing and less important to Canadians just because all these other issues have risen above them.
And this pipeline topic specifically, a microcosm of that, do you think?
I think to a certain extent, where people are looking at the trade-off between economic issues and environmental ones, where maybe now it's more worried about the economic side. They're more worried about how is Canada's economy going to perform, especially if we're dealing with our number one trading partner essentially becoming more hostile to us on the trade front. That is a huge threat to the Canadian economy. So then it becomes maybe more concerned about that than worry about, okay, if we build new pipelines, what does that mean for greenhouse gas emissions down the road? Which was also one of the regulatory hurdles they kind of put in front of Energy East, was asking those questions about, okay, well, this means future greenhouse gases and all of these other things. Those become less of a concern if you're worried that the entire economy is going to lose 3 or 4 points off the GDP just because of U.S. tariffs. So I think it is a bit of a microcosm of that whole shift in people's perspectives, where economic issues have risen a bit more to the forefront and environmental issues have gone a little bit to the background.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Jon, for the time today. I really enjoyed the discussion. And if listeners want to dig a little bit more into that data, where can they find your polling results?
Yeah, we publish all our results for free on angusreid.org. We have results dating back to 2014, so that we celebrated our 10th year at the Institute last year. And we have all our results up there, and you can browse by topic. So there's all our pipeline stuff, all our energy stuff, all our environmental stuff you can take a look at and see.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, Jon. It's been a pleasure to have you as our guest today.
Thanks for having me on, David.
And again, that is Jon Roe, Research Associate with the Angus Reid Institute. We thank him for his time today. So, are we about to see a pipeline renaissance in Canada? As always, it depends on who you ask. But there is a notable and sizable shift in public opinion about pipelines happening in this country right now. The results of the Angus Reid polling are reflected in how political leaders in Canada have been talking about pipelines over the past week. For example, Federal Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson says Canadian leaders should talk about it.
How do we try to reduce vulnerability with respect to dependence that we have with respect to the transportation of oil? I think the biggest vulnerabilities are actually not west. They are east, where, for example, Line 5 goes down into the United States and then comes back up into Canada, supplies significant oil to Ontario and Quebec, and in Atlantic Canada, where they are significantly reliant on oil from the United States. But of course, the Prime Minister and the Premiers are going to need to have some conversations about what Canada can and what Canada should do.
The Premier of Nova Scotia, Tim Houston, wants to see Energy East built.
I called for the Prime Minister and asked the federal government to immediately approve the Energy East project. That's something that they could do, and I encourage them to do. There was support from a number of premiers on that as well. If we needed more urgency to strengthen our country, we got it, right?
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, of course, wants to see more pipeline capacity.
Trans Mountain was a long process, an expensive process, but it's already proven its worth by stabilizing the price of Western Canada Select and narrowing the differential. And I think we'll see something equally encouraging once Coastal GasLink and the LNG Canada starts exporting. That being said, we could have done so much more. We could have with federal leadership.
And even the Quebec Premier, Francois Legault, says if the public is on board, they'll think about it.
Or a pipeline. We already had in the past those two projects. At the time, there was no social acceptability. We need to have social acceptability. Right now, no projects are tabled. If some projects are tabled, we'll look at them, but we need social acceptability.
All of those politicians speaking about pipelines all in 1 week. We'll have to wait and see what the next week brings. In And that is The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us, hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast platforms. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.